Hi, Dr. Bell. Thank you so much for being here with us today. For those of you who are not familiar, this is Dr. Perry Bell. He works at the Center for Child and Family Development here in Morristown, New Jersey, and we are honored to have him with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Bell, obviously, by saying that you work at the Center for Child and Family Development in Morristown, I gave a little hint to what you do and how you do it. But if you could share with our audience a little bit of your specialty and what you offer, that would be awesome.
Sure, absolutely. So at the Center for Child and Family Development, we're a multidisciplinary practice, which means it's one-stop shopping for a parent and family to come in with for psychotherapy services, maybe for testing services, for medication services. So we try and help and treat families in its totality. Me in particular, I'm a psychologist and I work primarily with children, teenagers, and parents, and how to raise healthy children.
Raising healthy children is a really difficult topic for parents of any kind, but specifically with everything that's been going on with the pandemic and with the culture in our nation right now in the wake of George Floyd. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic as it is. Most parents have had kids that have not seen school since around March 16th. As a child therapist, what have you seen from the impact that not being in a day-to-day social setting has had for kids?
Well, I mean, if we step back and first think about what a transition is like for anybody, you know, if you transition within your family, maybe you get engaged or married, or you buy a house, or you get a new job, any type of a transition is difficult, positive or negative. Now, if you think about the lives of children thrive on consistency. And I think most parents know that implicitly. So if you think about what something like a pandemic does to a child, it really raises a lot of new questions and challenges for children. And we're seeing children really struggle. You know, what does it mean to not visit my grandparents? What does it mean to only be able to see my friends really over a Zoom platform? You're seeing parents become very creative in how they can help kids with socializing, which is really the backbone of being a child, is being able to socialize. So we're coming up with a whole host of new challenges that parents are struggling with and that children are struggling with.
I mean, as a parent myself, I have a kid who has not been in school formally. He's obviously had distance learning. And I know that I've spoken with a ton of other parents who have had questions about kids who have IEPs or 504s, or perhaps have aides in the classroom. They've expressed concerns about their child's, social skills, their coping mechanisms, their aptitude for continued academics. What kind of advice can you offer parents like me who are sometimes wanting to tear out our hair especially during Common Core math, which I am not a very good specialist with? How can we help our kids while not losing our own minds?
Right. So you're asking a huge question. I mean, right now we're in a situation where there really is no playbook. Teachers are struggling with how to organize curricula, and they've really asked parents to pick up a lot more responsibility. Of course, while parents have their own, responsibilities like work and running a home, now you're being asked to be a teacher on top of all of that. In terms of things like 504s and IEPs, I would say, those are protective mechanisms to help children learn to their best. So to really hold teachers accountable and schools accountable for their role, because those are legal documents and children are entitled to certain services so that they can have a free and appropriate education.
In terms of working with a child who may have some special considerations from a mental health perspective, kids who are riddled with anxiety, kids who might have social difficulties integrating with friends, that really being in the school environment fostered or helped. Right. What can we talk about for parents who have kids who are now struggling at home, being separated from their support system, and parents are not necessarily equipped to be able to help their children?
Right. So a lot of the families I work with have had to become very creative in terms of creating social structure for their kids, because socializing is so important for child development. I've had families discuss consistent Zoom play dates, bike riding outside, which already inherently has a social distance component. So trying to come up with activities that include social distancing, that also give children a means of communicating and having real interaction. It's a really funny thing. There's this whole conversation about technology and video games and how children are just, so attached to their devices. And now we're seeing that we're in a period of time where children can really play as much as they want. I mean, given the circumstance. And we're seeing children now say, you know what, I'd rather like not play video games and I'd love to just see a friend. So I think one thing that the pandemic is highlighting is the importance of socializing for children. And I think it's a little bit of a commentary on what video games mean for kids and how really, although kids are, so attached to them, they also really prefer face-to-face interaction.
I know that a particular conversation that we've had in my home with a particularly precocious 10-year-old boy is that video games are his socialization now. He has an opportunity through his headphones to have a conversation with friends that are in other houses that he's not seeing on a regular basis. Sometimes I catch him FaceTiming those same friends on his separate device while he's playing the video games. With parents who have struggled with this issue of technology, and now school's on technology and socialization is on technology, what kind of a balance are you recommending from a therapeutic standpoint about when it's okay to pull the plug and when to recognize that this is actually literally their lifeline in some instances?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a really important question, and I want to address it in two different ways. One is the more scientific, what does the research say approach, which is an important starting point, but then we have to learn to apply it to a specific family, a specific child. So the research talks about 3 hours a day of video games as quote unquote overuse. Now, I think most kids, if you said to them, how many video games do you play, how much do you play a day? They're hovering around 3 hours. That's not so abnormal, but we're defining that within research as overuse. And the reason that is that it actually impacts the brain in some fairly significant ways. Children who are really under the age of 25, I'll say, because the brain's always developing up until about then. But if you look at kids in elementary school, their brains are forming connections. So when you're overusing technology, what ends up happening is the gray matter in the brain that helps the brain communicate and helps the brain regulate itself, have impulse control, delay gratification, being able to effectively communicate. Those skills can become challenged when video games are maybe too much a part of their neural world. And I just want to make another point that the areas of the brain that are activated by substances like alcohol and drugs are also activated when children overuse playing video games. And now what's interesting about that is that area of the brain is next to the area of the brain that regulates feelings. So now you have feelings and sort of addictive overuse, strong payoff, areas of the brain talking to each other, and together hijacking the front part of the brain, which is responsible for decision making. So it's almost an unfair battle for kids to get off of video games. That's the research part. If we apply...
Let me stop you for 1 second, because as a parent who has a child who has been engaged in video game use for quite some time, I just, kind of got to a point where like, okay, now I'm panicking. I definitely know that my child is using more than 3 hours of video games a day, both for socialization and enjoyment. What do you say to a parent like me who's obviously invested in, keeping my child's physical body safe, but also their mental and emotional health safe? And now I feel like I have to actually press pause on this interview, run downstairs, grab him off the Xbox that's keeping him occupied while we're doing this, and tell him that his gray matter is shrinking as we're speaking.
Right. So I'll talk, first of all, the interesting thing about gray matter is that it grows back, is that the brain is plastic. So through what we do, the brain changes. So we have to understand that although gray matter, white matter, the parts of the brain that may be impacted by overuse can also, a pianist who really plays a lot of piano, the part of their brain that up here that has to do with fine motor control will be more developed, connected, So we know that when kids take hiatuses from technology and they do things like spend time in nature or play outside or connect with other people, that our brains do reflect what we do, and they do have an ability to sort of be plastic. But I want to address your question, which is, what do we do with the video games? So here I'll start off with where I always begin, which is that I think of video games like candy. A little bit is okay, a lot not so good, only after dinner, and only when you demonstrate to me that you're not going to bounce off the walls after having it. So if a child is able to responsibly use video games, you know that they're not being overtaken by those areas of the brain that I mentioned before that are hijacking their ability to make good choices. So it's about responsible use and the demonstration of responsible use. So you mentioned your 10-year-old. If he's using, or if any child is using video games in a way where you ask them to get off the video games, you say, okay, mom, I can get off now. That's responsible use. If they're not able to get off and they're throwing massive temper tantrums, which, by the way, I'll note, I see a lot greater intensity and frequency of temper tantrums when it comes to video games versus, stop reading Harry Potter. It's a very different reaction. And I think there are neurological reasons for that, as we said. But to be able to say video games only after you've done what you need to do, only in moderation, and only when you demonstrate that you're able to be responsible in how you use it.
So you talked a little bit about the emotional reactions that children have when they're kind of withdrawing, let's say, from video games. But talk to me about how we as parents have conversations with our kids about the need for meditation, the need for nature, the need for interaction, even singular interaction in those environments when they don't have the same social support system that they had previously, where they can go, play sports or organized activities with their friends. How do we talk now about, yes, you need to disengage from this social link that you have, and you need to engage in other activities on your own, because that builds your flexibility in your brain and builds your emotional stability.
Right. So we need to think about things in three categories. What is a necessity? What is a need? And what is a want? And where do each topic, where do they fall into? So a video game, clearly that's a want. It's not a need. It's not a necessity. What is a necessity? Social interaction. Nature is a necessity. You have food, you have clothing, but your necessities and your needs are things that help you grow and help you develop. Your wants, which for children mostly include things like Fortnite, are things that you really can live without ultimately. And a lot of times when I'm intervening with children who play too much video games, I say to parents, remove it for 2 weeks and just see what happens. Tell them you'll get it back in 2 weeks. We just want to see what happens. Ultimately, kids find more constructive things to do. They find more creative things to do, more problem-solving types of activities. They spend more time outside. So I think giving kids the opportunity to do those other things and removing the sort of high power, high intensity, draw that the video games has, and to deliberately go, really even this summer, to give kids an opportunity to disconnect.
Let's talk about the summer a little bit, because I think that we're facing a new era for kids. Maybe which harken back to, and I'm going to date myself here, my era of the 80s, but kids are very scheduled. A lot of them have daycare opportunities, extracurricular opportunities, summer camp opportunities, and this summer, a lot of them may not, because their institutions may not be open and they may not have an opportunity from the providers, but some of them also are reluctant to reemerge into these activities if they are open and if they express anxieties about their safety. How do we talk with kids about the disappointment that they feel if they can't access these activities, but also support them if they're feeling anxious and feeling like there's pressure for them to go back, but they are not really comfortable yet?
So I think To answer, the simple answer is children need to feel validated. They need to feel like their feelings are okay. There, there has to be empathy. And if there's only one takeaway from our conversation today, and I say this to parents often, children require empathy. They need to feel like their parents understand them and that what they feel is okay. Nothing is more frustrating and invalidating for a child or an adult than feeling invalidated. Honey, who cares? All right, so you can't go to camp, but the words "but" that come up, but we can do all these other things. That invalidates the experience of the child. So we really want to make sure we're empathizing and validating with their experience, and then encouraging them to find ways to capitalize on the experience. So my next point after that is that children need to find meaningful ways to spend their time. One of the core fundamental aspects of child development is unstructured free time. The reason that is because kids need time to problem solve. They need time to be creative. Personally, one thing I don't love about video games, except some video games incorporate these aspects, is that it doesn't allow for the unstructured free time, the creativity, the ability to let your mind wander. I mean, when I grew up, I was outside all day, every day until dinner time. And there was no way on a beautiful day I would rather play a video game over football, basketball, baseball, riding bikes with my friends. It was a no-brainer. And I think this summer is a real opportunity to help push that agenda a little bit. And I think that this is really where this is one of the first generations of children where they're spending so much more time inside than outside in the time where they really would rather be outside. And I think that to answer your question about what do you do in terms of spending the time in camp, these are very difficult decisions. I mean, you have children who are saying, I'm scared to go to camp. If I go to camp, could I spread the virus? Will I be safe? Will I be able to see my grandparents? Is it worth it to go to camp? And what will camp even look like? Can we imagine camp with social distancing and masks? Will it be the same experience? I mean, these are all new questions that we have to grapple with right now, and they're difficult to answer.
So what particularly, obviously, that we do family law and divorce, and we have a lot of parents who have challenges co-parenting as it is. And these kind of conversations that we're having with kids who may have anxiety, kids who may not understand, kids who want to go to camp and one parent wants them to and one parent doesn't want to, or one parent can stay home and another parent can't stay home. What do you suggest for parents who are navigating the divorce process or who are divorced and who have difficulty having these conversations with each other, never mind with their kids?
Right. So my first piece of advice is to make sure you leave the children out of those conversations. A lot of times, I think when I see families who are going through a transition and are in the process of divorce or post-divorce or even contemplating, there's a tendency for the children to become too much a part of the discussion, too much a part of the emotional back and forth, and that's when children can really suffer. Divorce in and of itself, in my opinion as a psychologist, isn't necessarily detrimental to child development. I have families who navigate it very well. That comes down to how well you communicate needs and how well you keep your children outside of the decision-making process. I mean, parents who are together don't always agree on a lot of these topics. Of course, when you're not together, there's so much more emotion that gets involved. That emotion needs to stay between the parents and not be involved with the children. It's when children are involved in those emotions, they become something called triangulated, where they end up becoming a go-between, or they feel like they need to support one parent over the other. And that's really where you see a lot of the challenges in child development when it specifically comes to divorce. But I really want to make this point. It does not have to be. It does not have to be that children become triangulated, become used in certain situations, or inadvertently become emotional supports for their parents. It doesn't have to be that way. So I would really encourage parents to seek counseling, and I don't mean arbitration on the legal side. I mean on the emotional side of how do we work together in a way that benefits our children. I think if parents really genuinely have that goal, that these are all things that can be navigated. Absolutely.
We've been talking about difficult conversations with kids, related to the pandemic and related to social interaction and technology. But I think it would be doing a disservice if we didn't have a conversation about the culture of our nation right now and the wake of George Floyd and the issue of racism. As a parent, talking to my son about the issue of racism has been, at the top of the list in our home over the past couple of weeks, because we are committed to raising an educated and involved child that doesn't support intolerance and supports justice. So how do you, as a psychologist, recommend talking to kids at various ages about the issue of racism and bringing it into the home and having these, charged and emotional conversations with kids who may or may not have the emotional intelligence to understand it now, but need to be integrated into these conversations in order to be, educated and move forward in making a difference in people's lives?
Absolutely, and I think they have to be involved in the discussion, because it's inevitable that it's going to affect them in some way or another, and it's going to affect how this next generation begins to shape our social milieu. So to talk about George Floyd, and to talk about what we're dealing with as a country right now, children are scared because these are new experiences that they don't understand, and they're scared because it's scary. And different types of families need to have these discussions in different types of ways. The 2 points to remember that all kids need to think about are perspective taking and empathy. Perspective taking is the ability to step outside of yourself and think about somebody else's experience. Now, children happen to be, and they happen to be egocentric. They happen to be me first in their thinking. They have a hard time getting outside themselves and thinking, what's it like to be this other person? I don't have to agree. I don't have to support, but I have to be able to get outside of myself and ask, what is it like to be them right now? To me, that's the most important part for a 10-year-old. And again, it's all developmentally related, but for a younger child, to ask, what do you think it's like for somebody living in one of these communities? In any role that they might be had. Because I think there are multiple truths that children need to understand. And for a child to be raised in a home that promotes tolerance, inclusion, understanding, they need to understand that people have different experiences and to be sensitive to that. It's a type of
start a conversation like that. What's a good opener for a kid, for a parent to say to a child, this is how I'm going to introduce the topic and segue into it?
Sweetheart, what do you think it would be like to live in a city where this is going on? What do you think it would be like to be somebody who feels so marginalized that they maybe they're really upset? Or what does it feel like to be a business owner? What do you think it's like for a business owner right now? To ask them to, not to give them the information, but to give them the ability, to give them the opportunity to think through it on their own. Sweetheart, what would it be like for you to be in the middle of a protest? What do you think that would be like? How would you feel? I think to ask children and give them opportunities to reflect is really important.
Do you think it's important to be blunt and honest with them and sort of give them this, to talk about death and to talk about black and white and to talk about murder and to talk about, injustice and the way that we've seen the conversations at an adult level happen? Or do you think that that's counterproductive for kids?
I don't think it's counterproductive. I think it has to do with the way it's presented on their developmental level. Children should be aware of what's going on around them. At the same time, we have to recognize that the more, let's say, a 10-year-old is involved in a discussion like this, the more anxiety that is going to come up as well. And that's just not for a child. That's for everybody who I think is a citizen and sort of dealing with what we're dealing with. And the anxiety should not be turned away from. It should be embraced. And a parent needs to be able to say, this is a scary time, and it makes sense the way you're feeling, to validate those feelings. Now, we don't want to freak our children out and have them not be able to sleep and that kind of thing. So it's on their developmental level, and it's important that they know how they're being kept safe. So if we're talking about COVID, sweetheart, I'm keeping you safe by making sure you're social distancing, making sure that we're not unnecessarily interacting with other people, that we're washing our hands, that we're wearing masks. That helps children feel more secure, because there's a tendency for a child to do two major things when they're stressed cognitively. One is to catastrophize or make something small into something big, and to fortune tell, which is to say, to look into the future and sort of intuit this really bad outcome that's going to happen. Now, when a child starts to do these things, first we want to validate their experience. Sweetheart, I know you're feeling this way. Of course you're feeling this way. Other people are feeling this way too. I myself feel this way sometimes. And this is what we're doing to keep you safe. Let's check the facts. And that should really be the phrase. Let's check the facts. What's really happening? What is your anxiety mind telling you, your emotion brain? And what is really going on in front of us right now? And how do we contrast the two and understand it, to take it on head on and to really have a real discussion about it?
So I think what is most important for parents who are listening to you today is, besides being empathetic and validating our kids' feelings, because that's the takeaway that I'm hearing from you in this conversation, is that I need to make sure that my child feels heard and that I understand his emotions, and I'm expressing to him that having those emotions are okay. What would be your top takeaway tips for difficult conversations with children and working through those conversations as a parent or as a co-parent in the instance of divorce?
So we want to start off, like you said, with the empathy and with the validation. From there, we really want to go into normalizing their experience, that everybody feels that way sometimes. A lot of times when kids have strong emotions, they feel like I'm the only one, or how come I can't feel differently, which is an added layer of stress and pressure. And then I'd really open up a space of dialogue. Give children an opportunity to speak what's on their mind. It's so interesting to me clinically, where I'll ask some of these questions to children, and I'll say, what has it been like for you in COVID? How do you feel about this? And they'll start talking, and the parents will sit there stunned that their children have these insights or these thoughts or these questions they never asked. They never sat and asked their children. I think that parents, rightfully so, are in a space of protection, in a space of safety, in a space of how can I help my child be okay? And we forget that children have their own viewed points of the world. And that's what I love about my job, is that every child is their own world. And for me, it's entering into that world and trying to understand from within rather than from without. But I think parents need to give kids an opportunity to express their world and to make it okay, and to scaffold discussions around what they're thinking.
Is it okay to take a break and then come back to these conversations later if kids are uncomfortable, but try again at a different time?
Absolutely. And often I find that when parents invest time in just connecting to their children, whether it's through consistently having a date night or going on bike rides or just spending time where there's no critique and no judgment and no parenting and just connection, you'll often find that in those down times, that's when a child might turn to their mom or dad and say, when's COVID going to end? So it often happens in the unstructured moments when we've cultivated those relationships that these discussions happen.
So if I understand you correctly, I'm entering this interview, I'm going downstairs, I'm yanking him off the Xbox, I'm taking him outside, we're just going to sit on the deck and chill, and then that's when the conversation's going to happen. Did I get all that?
Ideally.
Perfect. I have now mastered child psychology. I'm ready to go. I'm good. Every parent like me has now made notes on the sticky notes, and we're out the door and ready to go. Is there anything else that you want to let our viewers or our audience know from a very specific point of view?
I would say one last point, which I really think weaves everything together, which is find opportunities to make meaning out of these difficult situations. These are things that are going to be in the textbooks. These are experiences that children are going to take with them. It's important that parents have discussions about, what does this mean to you? How can we make meaning out of COVID? How can we make meaning out of a tumultuous time where we're talking about race and social challenges, where children can grow and not just cope?
Dr. Bell, thank you so much. I know that there are tons of parents out there like me who are so grateful for your insight and for your thoughts. And I appreciate you being here and talking with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.